Alrighty, well, it is 4 o'clock, and I see that the cameras are rolling, so we'll go ahead and get started. Truthfully, I did not anticipate that a presentation about board games and history would be so popular, so thank you all so much for showing out. But yeah, so thank you all so much for joining me today. My name is Tom Clark, and I am going to take you on a journey beyond dice, where we will talk about the origins and rise of modern board games. So from humble beginnings to cultural phenomenons, and we'll really get into how they became such a significant part of our lives today. So just to dive in real quickly, just make everything easy to follow, I've got a table of contents here. So first, a little bit about me, and then just a brief introduction to provide some context on what we'll be talking about. Then I want to talk about board gaming before World War II, the rise of modern/Euro games, talking about the modern board game renaissance that we're going through today, and then finally we'll wrap up with a conclusion, and you'll have the opportunity to ask some questions. So with that being said, a little bit about me. So this is about 2 years worth of research. So that is not like 2 years of me like playing board games. This is 2 years of me like seriously looking into and kind of uncovering the history about board games, like taking a deeper look into them. On that, the next thing, I am not a historian by any means. I truthfully love history, and I also love board games, and doing this panel allows me to marry those two interests. So thank you all so much for allowing me to do that. And then lastly, my favorite board game is Subterra. I don't know if anyone else has played it, but a few people. But it's a very fun cooperative game. I'm a big co-op game guy. I think they're so much fun. That said, let's get right into it. So this is just a little bit of background information on presentation, what we'll be talking about, just some key concepts. So for background, we're really going through a modern board game renaissance. New board games are being released every single year, and the industry is growing. It feels like there is always something that's going on. So new mechanics, Kickstarters, whatever. Whereas in the past, it feels like, 20, 30 years ago, it seems like we were playing the same games over and over again. And so this presentation will really focus on the history and evolution of commercial or proprietary board games. So what do I mean by that? So by commercial board games, or games with an intellectual property associated with them, I mean games that are designed, produced, and sold as proprietary products by publishers or companies, and these are going to be protected by like intellectual property clauses, so copy marks, trademarks, patents, that sort of thing. And these are different from your traditional folk games, right, which are usually passed down through cultures and don't necessarily have a specific owner. So the perfect example of this, if you were to ask me who made the game Escape Plan, I could tell you Vitalis Lacerda made that. But if you were to ask me who made the board game Chess, it's like, well, I don't really know who invented that. So we're going to be focusing on the ones where you've got a clear owner. And we'll talk about those games just for context, but not really covered in detail. Another key thing is that we're going to consider proprietary games that don't necessarily have a board, so Coup, Love Letter, those games with cards, to be modern board, or in this case, tabletop games. The next key point is that we're going to focus primarily on board games that were developed in Europe and the US. And there's a couple reasons for this. The first is that these two regions were really pivotal in the mass production and popularization of a lot of the iconic games. And so they had a lot more market influence. And that's not to say that there weren't, proprietary board games released in other nations, or within other cultures, but these two regions were really the biggest in terms of that. And games out of these regions tended to resonate well globally. So that's another big reason. And then the last thing is just something I want you all to keep in mind while you're listening to our story. And that's keeping in mind kind of the context of where this is all taking place. And really, board games are something that mirror societal values and respond to major events. So we'll be able to see that. And a perfect example of this is Monopoly, which was released in the 1930s And so what's going on then, right? There's a Great Depression. And, monopoly allows folks to buy and sell property, something that they weren't able to do previously. So we can kind of see how different things that are going on and different trends really affect the board game market. So to get us started, I want to talk about one of the reasons why I love history so much, and that's because it's all about stories. And so today I would like to share a story with all of you, a story about board games, if you will, where we began, where we are now, and how we got here. So to start, let's step back in time to the 1700s. So picture yourself in this era, right? If you're in America, you've probably got your tri-corner hat on, and if you're in London, maybe you got a nice top hat on, but we're going to be focusing on England, so everyone's got top hats on. So prior to the mid-18th century, board games really just kind of existed over time, and it didn't really have a specific intellectual property, or no one person can be credited with creating a game. There really wasn't a market for it, and there's a few reasons because of that. So first, board games were traditionally inaccessible to the average person. There really wasn't a market for them. The first thing being they were expensive. These board games used specialized components. Each one usually had to be made by hand. Some of the board games were like dipped in gold. So they were expensive to make. But then the second thing is also folks didn't really have time unless you were super wealthy. Unless you had the time to burn to do that, most people were working. And so even if you did have a board game, it's like, when am I going to play it, right? Like, why am I going to have it? So all of this kind of contributed to there not really being a market for board games, and so no one really came forward to develop intellectual property or anything like that. Except the first industrial revolution was a really big change agent on this, where now we're starting to see folks being able to mass-produce pieces, mass-produce games, things like that. And so the first board game that really strayed away from this model of we're playing chess, we're playing checkers, we're playing Go was the Game of Goose. Now this game was released in 1574, or not released necessarily, but really gained popularity in 1574. And it was the first commercially produced board game. So it's got one of our two key components where we don't know who made it, but it's commercially produced, so it's produced on a large scale. And it initially started off as a gambling game with records going back to 1480, but really gained traction after it was a gift to King Philip II of Spain, sometime between 1574 and 1587. So this game exploded in popularity and was played kind of all throughout Europe. And it's very similar to Snakes and Ladders, so it's a race game where you essentially roll the dice and you see where you land. If you land on a good space, then you get to move forward a few more. If you land on a bad space, you move back. Except it really focused on kind of going through human life cycle. So the Game of Goose was a really big one, again, because it was the first commercially produced game. Moving on from this, we have A Journey Through Europe, or The Play of Geography. Now, this was the first published game in Europe with a specific creator associated with it. So this was published by John Jeffries, and it was a map-based game in Europe. So it didn't necessarily get the same traction as the Game of Goose did, but it was commercially produced, didn't get the same traction, but it does have a specific owner created to it. He was like a school teacher, and I think he was trying to teach a geography lesson or something. So A Journey Through Europe had one of the components where we know who made it, but it didn't get the same traction. It wasn't really made to make money. People still played it, but we didn't make it to make money. Now, the next game that I'm going to talk about, though, really merges those two things, and that is the Mansion of Happiness. So, to give you some background, the Mansion of Happiness is another race-based game. So players are going to race to the Mansion of Happiness by practicing virtues and avoiding vices. So, another race-based, right? For example, right, just pulling this out of my head. If you help an old woman cross the road, you go forward a couple spaces, and you gamble too much, you go back a couple spaces, right? So really kind of focusing on those virtues. Now, board games at this time were really tied to religion and morality. A big belief at the time was that board games should be teaching you something. They should say something about life. They were saying like, yes, I should be living a good and virtuous life. And so here we're kind of seeing a lot of those parallels towards morals where it's trying to teach you a lesson. And we're also just seeing a continuation of linearity board game based playing. So it's, there's not a lot of strategy. All you're doing is rolling dice, or in this case, you're using a spinner. All you're doing there's not a lot of strategy. You're just kind of moving on a board, seeing where you end up. Basically like Candyland. But the Mansion of Happiness was really pivotal because it was mass-produced in Europe and in the US. And so it really laid the groundwork for modern commercial board games. So now we've got those two components that I was talking about. We've got first, a name that we can put to the board game. And then second, we're mass-producing it. So this was produced by George Fox, and now we're able to mass-produce it, and we've got a name associated with it. And so the game itself has gone through multiple revisions. So, for example, the first version of the game was printed with real gold, and the paper that it was printed on was with like mummy wrapping. So, really expensive, a little bit wasteful. We had a lot of mummies, I guess, back then. So we were doing that. So eventually it would go through a lot of revisions to make it better for mass production. So we're going to be using smaller components. We're not going to be dipping it in gold. We're not going to be using our mummy supply, right? So going through a couple of other things like that. This game itself was originally produced in England and grew in popularity during the Second Industrial Revolution around 1870. In the United States, it was acquired by W&SB Ives to be published by the U.S., and it changed hands a couple of times, but eventually it was acquired by Parker Brothers in 1886 and became the longest printed board game, which ran from 1800 to 1926. So it ran for a really long time. Just a fun fact about it. The Mansion of Happiness used a spinner instead of dice because at the time dice were considered immoral. They were associated with like gambling and referred to the bones of the devil. So, people did not like dice. And in a game about morality, you probably don't want to have dice involved. So they used a spinner, which is a good way to get around that. And then just another big thing is it inspired the game of life. You're probably seeing some parallels. So it inspired the game of life, or rather the checkered game of life as it was called. And it was released in 1860 and really kind of became the foundation for the game of life, which was actually released in 1960, right after. And then just another kind of fun fact about it, you might be able to see on the screen, but it has the distinction on it, the first board game published in America, but this isn't true at all. It's the longest running printed board game, but it's not the first one printed in America. That belongs to the Traveler's Tour Through the United States, which was published in 1822. But it didn't get as much recognition, so no one really talks about it. Going on to this idea about board games and morality, the earliest board games, and those published in the US, were really based on Christian morality, like I was talking about before. The idea here is you want to lead a virtuous life so that you can get into heaven. And so remember what I was talking about before, it being a reflection of the times. This reflected the times. I mean, religion was such a big deal, and morality and leading a good life. So, of course, we're going to make our board games about that. So, some examples of this, the Mansion of Happiness, and the one I have up here is The Game of Pope or Pagan, or Siege of the Stronghold of Satan by the Christian Army. So, very long title. We used two of them. Released in 1844. And so this was... So W&SB Ives, which I mentioned before, is really credited with being the first major manufacturer of games in the United States, and a lot of those games drew upon Christian morality. So think W&SB and Ives, they're big on Christian morality, and so they published at least 24 games in the 1800s and was eventually bought out by Parker Brothers. And Parker Brothers is a very big name when we talk about early board gaming even to today. So they were a major player in the board game field. And I mean, even today, right? I could go to my parents' house, I could check in the board game closet, and at least 5 of them are going to have the Parker Brothers logo on them. Or, if you check your own board game closets, you'll probably see some as well. So, they were major before they got bought out by Hasbro. And they had a different belief set than WSP5s. They believed that games should be played for fun and not necessarily need to emphasize morals or values, that we can just have games and we can enjoy them. And so games shifted to a lot more secular values and had different definitions of success. So, for example, the checkered game of life, right, which was inspired by the Mansion of Happiness. We took the Mansion of Happiness and we shifted its definition of success towards more material things. So attending college, marriage, getting rich, stuff like that. That's how they wanted to define success. Another good example of this is Game of the Messenger Boy, where a messenger boy can climb up through the ranks and work his way to president. And so many of the games on the next slide that I'm going to show you were owned by Parker Brothers. Now, with this shift, a lot of new board game mechanics returned. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that they're related, shifting away from morality and shifting, and new mechanics and stuff. But it is a trend that we see, and so all these new games are relying a lot less on luck or roll of the dice. But now we're starting to see a little bit of skill involved. So just talking about some of the games on the list here. Jury Box, which is a murder mystery game. There's a lot of murder mystery games out right now, and it was eventually really made way for Clue, released as Cluedo in England, but as we know it, Clue. Scrabble, Sorry, Game of the World, which is a geography game. So, all of these are like new mechanics. Now you've got actual decisions to make. You're not just rolling dice, which is really cool to see. And so we're starting to see some new trends emerge. And I also just want to talk about these big 3 game companies that have emerged. So the first is Milton Bradley Company. And so they took on a more children's game based approach. So a lot of their games, Hungry Hungry Hippos, Guess Who, Jenga. The next one is Cell Shout and Ryder. And out of these 3, they are the smallest. But they've got a couple games. They've got Scrabble. Parcheesi was a very big one. They were small, but very consistent. And then lastly was Parker Brothers. So they're your Monopoly, your Clue, your Risk. That's a lot of their big games. So talking more about kind of leading up into World War II, I want to talk about the different decades in the 1900s and kind of how board games evolved during that time. So each decade can really be characterized by a couple different things. So firstly, when we talk about the early 1900s, so we're talking about 1900 to 1922, we're really seeing the effects of the Second Industrial Revolution, which occurred in around 1870. So mass production has really started to heighten. Companies started cutting costs and really started catering to a national audience. So we have to think to ourselves, what is happening at the time? So we've got advancements in communication. We've got advancements in transport. A lot of businesses now are no longer being bound by regional constraints. This is all, we can advertise across the country now. And so these board game companies start appealing towards a more national audience. And then I mentioned before, board game companies started cutting costs. So after 1900, wood boxes for board games were really being used less frequently, and board game pieces became cheaper and smaller. Another big thing is there was less attention paid to the ornamentation, or kind of like the design, like the board game design, right? We're shifting away in order to cut costs from beautiful game covers and stuff like that. We're simplifying it. We're making it easier to understand, and that's all a part of cutting costs. And another big thing to note is that due to the financial panic in 1907, game production really slowed, and then was eventually followed by the First World War. And so the game industry started catering towards a new generation. So World War II brought on the Roaring '20s. So we're now in the 1920s. And America is enjoying an economic boom. And there's 2 big things that come out of this. So the first is folks have more money to spend on board games and leisure. People are having a grand old time. They're spending more time on board games and stuff. And also, we've got more time to spend on it. So previously, where there had been issues before where you did not have time, you did not have money, now you've got time and money. So people are buying more board games. They're having more fun with it. And then we move on to the 1930s, so the Great Depression. Now, you might think to yourself, right, oh, well, there's a Great Depression. No one has money to spend on board games, so that's going to kill the industry. And that's actually quite the contrary. So the American, and I mean really global, board game industry weathered the Great Depression pretty well. There's two key points. So at this time, board games were being mass-produced. So we'd figured out how to cut costs, how to make them cheaper, and they were ultimately much more inexpensive because we have all of these printed from the 1920s. People can buy them at a relatively low cost. And then secondly, board games were replayable. You could buy a board game and be entertained for hours. So board games really provided a good and big outlet during the 1930s. So again, you buy a board game once and you've got hundreds of hours of gaming. So the Depression wasn't really felt until about 1932. So games like backgammon were revived. Jigsaw puzzles were very popular. And there was a kind of like board game boom in 1936 and 1937, where board game companies were able to start developing more games and filling higher quality game boxes and everything like that because they had been doing relatively well. Now, everyone had taken a hit, but the board game industry really just kind of weathered it. And so, Milton Bradley, right? So remember, they had catered to children primarily, started putting games in classrooms. So they made the classroom into a game and developed the game, go to the head of the class. So we're seeing a lot of those sorts of trends. And there were also a lot of new board game companies that emerged. And we have to talk about it. It's going to be Monopoly. We got to talk about it. I know it's a little bit of a hot topic. Some people absolutely hate Monopoly. Some people absolutely love Monopoly. I'm of the opinion that Monopoly is slightly overhated, but that's just me. So Parker Brothers' big break really came when they bought Monopoly in 1935. So no proprietary game ever gained such popularity around the world. And the Depression created an environment in which a game that would allow folks to buy and sell property, something they couldn't do in the real world, would thrive. Interestingly, though, a similar game which Milton Bradley published called Easy Money was very similar to it, but it wasn't met with equal success, and I think that's part of Parker Brothers just getting on it early and advertising it. The game was also a little bit slower than Monopoly, so that could have been another reason. But moving on from the 1930s, we now move to the 1940s, and a lot happened. Most notably World War II. And so once again, the country had to move its manufacturing efforts towards defense. So board games could no longer use metal for their game boards, and the metal tokens that board game companies were using were now shifted to using composite plastic pieces. So, and when we talk about the types of games that really emerged from this period, were a lot of games about war, games about promoting patriotism, and games about patriotism in the U.S. became very popular. And a few updates just on the kind of key board game players during this time. The first is Milton Bradley. They introduced the Game of States, which is sort of a geography. You travel from state to state, selling different goods. And then they eventually cut their game line from 410 to just 150. I say just 150, but when you go from 410 down, it's, yeah. And then in 1941, the company, not in 1941, before the war ended, they released Chutes and Ladders. Parker Brothers bought the rights to Cluedo, which was an English game, and re-released it as Clue. And then a small company called the Production and Marketing Co. Began manufacturing a crossword game called Scrabble, and that became one of the most popular games in the world. So now we're starting to see kind of where our first favorite, maybe childhood, board games start coming from, right? This is the period where a lot of those classic American games start coming out. And so now we'll talk about the birth of modern and Euro games. So by this point, World War II has ended, and it really did pave the way for a new generation of board games. And culturally, there were a lot of influences as well. The first being the television. So TVs started finding their ways into more and more homes at this point, and it really transformed the game industry. So television had two direct effects. First, it formed a sort of leisure activity that took away time from other pastimes like board games, so it was a little bit of a competitor. But interestingly, it also allowed advertisers to reach a mass market. Now, only the largest companies could afford to advertise on television, and this really widened the gap between the giants in the industry and then the small manufacturers. So this is one of those things that really creates a big gap. And another big thing was that advertisers could pander to children. There was a lack of regulations on what you could and couldn't say on television, and so parents really did not know what was being fed to their children. A lot of it was, oh, everyone else has it, so you should have it too, and so that was like a very big thing. And television also gave a new meaning to the concept of licensing. So during the 50s, many game companies started acquiring more and more licenses to television shows, and so there was a lot more attention given to the name and the character on the box rather than the product inside. And I think a perfect example of this is Monopoly today. So we've got Monopoly, we've got like the basic version, but there's a million different licensed versions of Monopoly. There's SpongeBob-opoly, there's like Star Wars Monopoly. There's so many different like types of Monopoly. So we're starting to see where this sort of focus on the characters and the licensing come into play rather than the object in the box, because it proved it's successful. Now the next sort of cultural thing that came out were chain stores. And chain stores, you'd think you're one-stop shops that have everything. So they really grew in popularity in the 50s and really affected the distribution of games. And this was partially because folks in the US were doing better financially. So shopping malls provided really easy one-stop shopping, and toy chains could offer discounted prices, right? They could buy in bulk and then they could sell at a lower cost, scales of economy and whatnot. So the small game store owner really found it difficult to compete, and by the 1990s, a lot of them had gone out of business. So independent and inventors and small manufacturers really had a hard time getting their games into stores. And this was a big reason why, around, I'd say from the 50s to like the 90s, there's not a whole lot of small like indie games coming out. There's a few, right? But there's really not a lot. So they're all coming out from those big companies. And think about like Walmart and Target today. You can buy your groceries, electronics, and board games all under one roof. And this has a couple of effects, but firstly, it makes board gaming more accessible. You don't have to go to like a specialty store to get them, but it does hinder those small businesses. Now, the next part I want to jump into are some of the regional differences that emerged between the United States and Europe. And this is probably one of the most impactful slides because it really talks about the split from our traditional American games towards modern games, or as many people call them, Euro games. So to start with the United States, a lot of them after World War II focused on war. So think of Axis and Allies, Risk, Battleship. We're talking about patriotism. We're talking about war. It's all about winning. And it's especially focused on head-to-head competition. You are going against another person, and luck also played a very big factor in that. A big point in this is that games were zero-sum. So whatever is a win for you is a loss for your opponent. If I own a hotel on Boardwalk on Monopoly and someone lands on it, they lose money, I get money. So whatever's a win for me is a loss for them. And so it makes it much harder for your opponent. And another big thing that we see is player elimination, where you could lose in round 2 and be left sitting there on your phone for the rest of the session, right? So this was another big thing. In other words, you really should have bought more railroads. But yeah, so this focus on direct competition and elimination really kind of reflected society at the time, right? We're focusing on success. We're focusing on individualism and this economic growth in the US. Now let's move over to the other half of the world, and we'll talk about Eurogames in Europe. So Eurogames really emerged as a response to the cultural and social landscape of post-war Europe. So we're really emphasizing rebuilding, cooperation, peaceful competition over direct conflict. And so this was a very big effect of World War II. For obvious reasons, games about war, domination, winning and stuff didn't really resonate that well in Europe, especially like Germany, where a lot of those games came out of following World War II. And so, unlike American games, Eurogames really prioritize resource management, strategy, and long-term planning. Another big thing is these different themes and mechanics. So games focusing on growth and development. So you've got your farming, your trading, your city building, which really, again, focused on Europe's focus towards reconstruction and community building. A great example of this is Catan. And most of us have probably played it, but it really encourages trade and negotiation and allows players to succeed without directly undermining your opponents, right? I mean, I can go and build my settlements and there's no real direct conflict. Now, don't get me wrong. I mean, it's really annoying when someone doesn't trade me sheep for wood or wood for bricks or whatever. So that, I don't know, maybe that can be a form of conflict, but really, it's not going to, what you do is not like hurting your opponent like at its core. And there's also no direct player elimination. So it really emphasizes player engagement until the end. So everyone can continue playing regardless of your performance. I mean, I could have, I don't know, like one settlement or like only one town built, and I'm still in the game, right? Even if whoever else has longest road has a million different things, whatever. There's also a focus on points and progression. So points or victory being determined by victory points through your strategic decisions that you make instead of taking out your opponents. And this all, again, goes back to just the landscape of post-war Europe, where we want to highlight diplomacy, balance, shared prosperity, all of those good things. And so with that in mind, we really do see where a lot of modern board game themes and ideas are coming from. And so when we talk about modern games, we really are referring to Eurogames. So again, when we talk about the differences between the two, we really can kind of see, culturally how we've split, how American games have split from European games. So, I mean, some key differences here. In the US, it's a lot of competitive experiences rooted in a lot of rooted formats. So what do I mean by that? I mean, American games really focused on tried and true methods. We aren't, we're not going to try to reinvent the wheel. We've got Monopoly, we'll release it a bunch of times. This is a classic. You learn to play it once when you're, 9, 10 years old, and then, you never have to be taught again. Whereas Eurogames, for example, they were much more innovative, and they were definitely a lot more experimental. So in contrast, it's, Brass Birmingham. You can't learn that at 9, 10 years old and then be expected to play when you're 23. You're probably going to have to relearn the rules a little bit. So we can start to see a lot of these differences, and these trends really are going to continue from about the 1950s until the 1990s, where we talk about the modern board game renaissance. So this is the point where we are at today. And like before, after World War II, there are really some major cultural differences that are affecting the board game industry. And the first big one is the internet. So the internet really lessened the gap between the biggest and the smallest board game producers, whereas the TV widened it. So now we're bringing them closer together. And why do I say that? firstly, it really leveled the playing field. So smaller indie publishers are able to promote and distribute their games through online advertising, through forums, crowdfunding platforms like Kickstarter, right? And the effects of the internet really can't be understated in the board gaming industry. Another big thing is just affordable marketing. It is so much cheaper to advertise on the internet than it is to run a television ad. So these small producers are able to pump out 1 million different ads for their games and talk about it. There's also online community. So we've got Board Game Geek, BGG, which allows spaces for folks to connect and talk and share ideas, reviews, feedback about different games. And this all really contributes to the big theme of the internet, and that is board game democratization. So aside from Kickstarter and crowdfunding sources, which we'll talk about in a little bit, independent publishers are able to crowdsource and receive feedback from gamers to help with their board game production. So the big thing here, the big takeaway is previously board game testing was really only done by a few select individuals in whatever company was publishing the game. So you would just have like your internal group, you'd maybe get the CEO, maybe get a couple other folks and say, okay, what do we think? But now what we can do is we can send out betas. We can say, hey, donate early, we'll give you an early access version of the game. Stuff like that. So it can be tested around the world before actual release. And then as part of this, it keeps innovating and it keeps getting better and better and better because we've got so many different people contributing to this. So again, board game democratization is a big thing. Board games are really becoming a community effort. And so again, it's really just allowed board games to flourish. Now the next big thing I want to talk about is Catan. And you really cannot talk about modern board games without talking about Catan. So when Catan, originally the Settlers of Catan, was released in 1995, it absolutely revolutionized modern board gaming and became a catalyst for the modern board game renaissance. And this isn't thanks to the Eurogame mechanics that I mentioned previously. So Catan made accessing those mechanics much easier and much more mainstream. So first, resource management, trading, all of those key Euro games that we saw, or those key Euro mechanics that we saw before. Also, player interaction, right? We're focusing on negotiation and trade. A huge one was accessibility and depth, where Catan is, relatively to other modern games, it's really not too tough to teach. I mean, you could learn to play it pretty easily, but there is a lot of strategic depth. I mean, it's a mile deep. You could get by and play with other folks, but I mean, there's a million different layers to it, and so that was what made it so exciting for folks. Going back to some of those, again, Eurogame mechanics, we've also got the focus on victory points rather than elimination, and really was a gateway game. So it introduced a lot of people to modern board games, especially Euro games. It really is one of those kind of gateway games that people like to talk about. Now, when also talking about it, it also had a big effect on the industry where games started shifting how they would make games. And so, or companies would start changing how they would make their games. So the first is that they started adopting modular boards, or boards that would change in between games. Now there were a couple before this, but Catan really kind of popularized it. So, now we're seeing, okay, we can change the board before games, and we're seeing a different thing each time. So the game it's a different experience every single time, which is awesome. And because of its popularity, it really helped establish board gaming as a mainstream hobby rather than just a family pastime. This is something that you can get into. This is something you can join the community. You can talk about it. You can do a panel on board games if you want. So seriously, board gaming, really because of it, is becoming a legitimate hobby at this point, and the industry is just exponentially growing around it. And so today, Catan really is a benchmark for design, and inspired countless games after it. Now, this last section, I just want to talk about some of the cultural influences that have affected modern board game design. The first is Kickstarter and crowdfunding. So crowdfunding platforms like Kickstarter are really a major force in the board game industry. I feel like I go on BGG and there's a million things I can look at about different Kickstarters and whatever else you can support games. And it allows designers to fund projects directly from their audience, so you no longer have to go through traditional publishers and retailers. And this really led to a rise in indie games and very niche markets. as well as the ability for fans to be a part of that creation process. So again, going back to board game democratization. And so Kickstarter has helped launch games like Exploding Kittens, Gloomhaven, Root even. And so it really has helped designers to reach global audiences and give certain benefits for backing a project early. So the next big thing is the Spiel des Jahres, which is the Game of the Year award, and it's really one of the most prestigious in the board gaming world. So it recognizes exceptional game design, and winning the award obviously leads to increased sales, recognition, and just a much wider distribution for the winning game. And so games like Catan, Carcassonne, Ticket to Ride all won Spiel des Jahres, and these are all games we've at least heard of, if not played. And so it really highlights, again, that innovation, accessibility, and quality in game design. And the reason I bring it up is because it helped to legitimize the board game hobby and industry. So having a prestigious award really encourages the gaming industry to prioritize thoughtful, well-crafted games and enhance the overall perception of board gaming as a serious hobby. So think like the Oscars or the Grammys. The next thing is communities and conventions. So like the thing that we are all at right now. Board game conventions like Gen Con, Essenspiel, MAGFest are key cultural events where publishers, designers, and fans are able to come together to showcase new releases, discuss trends, and really network with each other. So these conventions are really crucial for launching new games and providing opportunities for fans to engage with the board gaming community. This, again, also contributes to board game democratization. Perfect example, MAGFest. Right now, in the room over there, there's a bunch of indie publishers, and they're looking for feedback. They're looking for play testers. And so when you come to MAGFest and you are interacting with those indie publishers and indie designers, you are contributing to the... That's crazy. Something crazy just happened. I think it's a werewolf. You're contributing to that board game democratization, which is really cool because it's it's right here. And the last thing I want to talk about just really quickly is digital and online play. The rise of digital platforms like Tabletop Simulator, Board Game Arena, stuff like that, have done really great things. They've made board gaming much more accessible, allowing players to play online with friends around the world. So if you've got friends all across the country or you can't get everyone together in the same place, this allows you to do that. Another big thing, too, is it's also a lot more low cost than board gaming. Unfortunately, the price of board gaming has gone up. I mean, there are games going for $100, $150 just for one, and it's crazy. But that's another thing. I mean, there's Tabletop Simulator, for example. There are questionably legal mods that you can get of different games, but they're free, right? So, that's just another kind of cool thing that I like bringing up. I prefer playing in person, but that is, of course, an option for folks. Now, just to go into closing, firstly, board games really have undergone a remarkable transformation throughout history. I mean, we started with that, basically just rolling dice and hoping for the best. And we've got influences from both American and European design philosophies that are really shaping the modern landscape. And so because of that, I always say that we are living through a renaissance of board games. It feels like there are 100 new games coming out every year, whereas, 20, 30, 40 years ago, that really wasn't the case. So it's a very exciting time to be into board games, and it's just more accessible than ever. So I just want to thank you all so much for allowing me to present this. Again, I love board games and I love history, and so doing this presentation allows me to marry those two interests. Thank you for listening to my story, and I hope it was good. Thank you all. I will, so how much time do we have? So we've got about 15 minutes left. I'll move on to questions. Hat in the back, I saw you first.
I know you said your research focused primarily on USA, European, since kind of around the 1500s, 1800s, but did you happen to come across what is the oldest game, or what is considered one
So the question was about, what is the oldest game? If, we're not talking about proprietary, we're talking about like non-proprietary. What's the oldest game? Truthfully, it's a little bit hard to tell. Board games have just kind of always existed, and so it's one of those things where there's no clear answer. Chess is definitely an old one, though. So. Earliest games, probably the classical period, because that's when folks started having a lot more time to hang out. You didn't have to. It wasn't like hunter-gatherer anymore. You weren't in survival mode always, and so around the classical period, we start to see a lot more, particularly out of like the Middle East and Greece. So, yeah. Yep. But sorry, by the game, which game? Yep. Oh.
And I wasn't sure if like maybe you had information around that or knew of other games that like specifically referenced.
Yeah, so I mean, I don't have any specific information on like if that was a specific reference to it or not, or whatever. The Game of Goose was really just a big one. I think it as like the great-great-grandfather of the Game of Life, because it is like one of the first games where you're going through human life and you're avoiding obstacles and, trying to live a virtuous life, I guess. But yeah. So.
Has your research touched on wargaming, like Kriegspiel, invented in Russia, train officers, but then civilians got their hands on it and decided, oh, this is fun act.
So you said, has my research touched on like war gaming at all, or?
Yeah.
Okay. So not too much. I mean, those games. I know there was a little bit more of a push in like the 70s and 80s around like wargaming. A lot of those kind of tabletop games. I haven't touched on it too much, but they're popular. They're cool. So. Gotcha. Yep.
So certainly with the globalization of games now, you get a lot of hot trends for a period in terms of genre, right? Roll and Writes have had a Day in the Sun, Trick Takers have had theirs. Not that those games stopped being popular, but right, suddenly everyone's making a Trick Taker, everyone's making a Roll and Write. Campaign games are hot right now. Obviously, that's happening a lot now with everyone online and all the connectivity, all the trends being much more visible. In your research, have you seen that pattern continuing, going farther into the past of like, Monopoly came out and everyone suddenly had a business mobile game, right? You see those kinds of genre-based trends.
Yeah. So I mean, so the question was about, do we see folks start like copying each other? Like everyone wants to do a trick taking game now, or everyone wants to have like implement this mechanic in their game, and that's a really good point. So I think the first like kind of board game is when we go back to the Game of Goose. Everyone wanted to do the limited games that were out, everyone wanted to do a racing game where you roll dice and then, you go X spaces, right? Like that's what, and that was the theme at the time. In terms of other things, Monopoly is another great example where everyone wants to do like a property trading game. So I mentioned, it was like Cash Money or something. It was released by Milton Bradley. So around the time Monopoly was released, there were a lot of those other games that were out there. So the game that Milton Bradley had done, like also you were buying properties and you were putting hotels on them and doing stuff like that. So around the 1930s, they were doing that as well. And people and companies tend to like copy each other and try to make similar things off of other models. So yeah. That's a great question. So the question is about, I'm trying to think of the best way to phrase it, but it's about like trends versus is something actually like in response to like social events, right? Yeah. So. Yeah, I think it's in response to like social events. So you talk about we've got a lot more environmental games coming out right now. Like Wingspan, Arc Nova, stuff like that. And I think that's there's a very big emphasis on like conservation, global warming, and stuff like that happening right now. And so I think that those board games are kind of in a response to that. I don't think it's necessarily, oh, there's a nature game, or oh, these are like comfy games. I think it's, these are things that are important to folks right now, and so that's what we want to make games about. Let's see, do you have another one?
Yeah, I'll throw one out. Also,
Why not?
You were talking about different regional trends you've seen. Obviously, right, the effect of, say, how Europe was wanting to make fun versus how the States were. I know there's also a becoming more visible scene out in Japan. Have you noticed any differences in really how trends between Japanese design?
So the question was about Japanese design versus, which is new and coming out and very exciting, versus American and European design, which had previously dominated. And honestly, I have not looked too much into Japanese design. That one's a little too new wave for me. But it is definitely certainly interesting, and I think Japan's in a place right now where they're carving their own path, and so I think there'll be some very unique things we'll notice about Japanese games where, if you were to ask my opinion, I think they're gonna take both the best things from both American and European games and blend them. So, yeah. Right. Yeah. No, I'm not writing a book or anything. I'm just doing this because I like history. So maybe I will. But all right, awesome. Well, if there are no more questions, I will be here setting up if you have any you want to ask privately. Thank you again so much for joining. I really appreciate it. So.